Good day all. Today I'm going to be sharing my experiences of using a citizen science-based approach in the Okavango River Basin, where extensive stakeholder engagement was used to complement and deepen a desk-based livelihood vulnerability study. I'd like to begin by asking everyone to take a moment to think about what the term livelihood means to each of you. How would you describe your livelihood to someone? Does it generate income? Is it your full-time job? Do you do it alone, with a team, or with your family? Does it require water, energy, or transport? And what affects your livelihood? The weather, the economy, or maybe your physical capabilities? Without the luxury of being able to discuss these answers together in person today, I'd hazard a guess that everyone listening in would have a slightly different response to these questions. What this tells us is that it's impossible to come up with solutions to improve the livelihood of an individual or community without first allowing them the opportunity to define what the concept of livelihood actually means to them. This was one of the biggest learnings that came out of a series of community engagements in the Okavango River Basin, which centered around the topic of sustainable livelihoods. To provide some context, I was part of a team working with the Okavango River Basin Commission to design and implement livelihood projects in Angola, Botswana, and Namibia. Communities in these countries are exposed to a vast range of social, environmental, climatic, and political challenges and require support to enhance their resilience to these external shocks and stresses. To identify these livelihood projects, we began with a desk-based approach that drew on extensive existing socioeconomic, environmental, and climate data to develop GIS maps of the basin. You can see an example of this on the screen now. When laid on top of one another, the maps collectively indicated areas that were exposed to hazards, such as floods, droughts, and diseases, as well as where compounding livelihood-related vulnerabilities existed, be these physical, economic, social, or environmental. You can see these on the screen now. We termed these areas hotspots. However, while this initial analysis provided a useful basis for identifying hotspots, we knew this information was largely static. It was not at a granular community scale and did not fully capture the dynamic nature of basin development. We knew that until we had this more detailed level of information, we would not be in a position to begin conceptualizing appropriate livelihood projects that addressed the specific community's needs. We therefore embarked on a process of conducting in-depth consultations with stakeholders who live and work in the basin, as well as climate scientists, sociologists, and various levels of government. The coming together of these different groups, who typically do not engage to collectively discuss and make decisions on livelihood issues, required an interactive approach that allowed for balanced sharing of information and opinions. A fundamental starting point for these discussions was the unpacking of key concepts to create a shared understanding of what terms meant to the stakeholders. These included terms like livelihoods, hazard, vulnerability, and adaptive capacity. We quickly learned that these terms were interpreted quite differently based on where the consultation was taking place and the group of stakeholders in the room. Once we'd converged on the meaning of key terms, we proceeded with interactive group work mapping exercises. Given the groups comprised different genders, ages, social hierarchies, cultures, and languages spoken, we found that group work discussions were most conducive when centered around map visuals of the area in question. Participants were divided into groups, where our intention was to ensure a mix of representatives in each group. And they were tasked with, firstly, locating drivers that influence the economic, social, and environmental welfare of their livelihoods. We then asked them to determine whether these drivers were hazards or vulnerabilities. And finally, we asked them to identify these hazards and vulnerabilities on the maps, and where they compounded in a single geographic area, we considered that area a hotspot. This citizen science-based approach proved key to ensuring that the resultant hotspot delineations reflected on-the-ground realities. It was really encouraging to realize that the hotspots identified by stakeholders were very closely aligned to those that had previously come out of our desk-based map work. It is, however, important to note that the stakeholders provided much more depth and granularity to the descriptions that underpinned the hotspots themselves, which in turn led to the design of more targeted project responses. These project responses were discussed at length with stakeholders who shared thoughts on which areas should be considered a priority and what infrastructural and governance solutions would be most appropriate. The consultations also provided a platform for the Okavango River Basin Commission to mediate discussions on how livelihood issues should be governed and how information should be shared and used by basin citizens, the scientific community, and importantly, government decision makers. The photograph you can see on the screen now is an example of the types of maps that were generated through group work. You'll see that colorful stickers were used to indicate different types of hazards and vulnerabilities, and where they're clustered together, they indicated potential hotspot areas. The outcomes of this group work in Angola, Botswana, and Namibia was used to generate this hotspot map, which is accompanied by written hotspot characterizations in all of the 6 areas outlined on the map. I've highlighted some of the characterizations that underpinned the 4th hotspot we identified, which is along the border of Angola and Namibia. And some examples of the issues that we describe in the characterization include those such as weak road infrastructure and wash facilities, high incidence of gender-based violence, extended droughts, and in certain parts, flash flooding, and high incidence of human-wildlife conflict. These engagements had the threefold benefit of extracting stakeholder knowledge and perspectives in a discursive and engaged manner, building national capacity around key climate concepts, and importantly, garnering consensus and ownership of the approach and its resultant outcomes. This buy-in was the most fundamental aspect of the process, given the hotspot map is considered a living tool, which will be updated as circumstances in the basin evolve and as information becomes more accessible and granular. The outcomes of this work are now being used by decision makers and financiers to support more strategic, inclusive, and impactful investments in the basin that best serve communities most in need. In closing, I'd like to thank you for your time and encourage you to look for more information on our approach at our website, credif.net. You can also watch a 10-minute documentary on the consultation process as we moved through Botswana, Namibia, and Angola. Alternatively, please contact me for more information, which I'd readily share with you.